Back in the 1800s and 90s, freak shows and human oddities were common all across the world, showcasing famous figures such as Tom Thumb and the Elephant Man. Generally, these were people with severe deformities or rare conditions. But promoters like Barnum pushed it further, turning extreme bodies into public spectacle. From alligator-skinned girl to real-life octoman, here are the 15 freakiest circus freaks that actually existed in real life. Let's start off with number 15. Lazarus and Joannes Baptista Colloredo. The Colloredo brothers were one of the earliest recorded sets of conjoined twins, born in Italy during the early 1600s, long before the days of the famous Siamese twins, Chang and Eng. Lazarus was the dominant twin, fully able-bodied and known to have fathered several children. His brother Joannes Baptista, however, was a parasitic twin attached at the chest. Joannes couldn't speak or move and was often covered up with a cloak when they weren't performing. Still, the two toured all over Europe and gained immense fame, even performing before King Charles I and Queen Henrietta. But their story took a strange turn. After being mocked, Lazarus killed a man in a fit of rage. He was taken to court but wasn't executed. The reason? The court couldn't justify killing Joannes, an innocent man, just to punish his brother. So they let him walk. The Colloredos weren't just freak show performers. They became a walking legal mystery. Number 14. Igorot Village. In 1905, Coney Island opened Igorot Village. Fresh off its success at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the exhibit brought 50 indigenous people from the Philippines, specifically the Igorot tribe, to live in public view. Marketed as savage headhunters, the Igorot were forced to perform daily routines in front of crowds, staged dances, fake weddings, and mock tribal fights. But the worst part was the dog feasts. Real dogs, often taken from the local pound, were killed, cooked, and served, all to please the audience. The Igorot had to eat them every day, whether they wanted to or not. The display wasn't just exploitation, it was humiliation dressed as education. These human zoos were marketed as anthropology, but were deeply rooted in racism and spectacle. Over time, public opinion shifted. By the mid-1900s, such exhibits were seen as shameful, and the Igorot village faded away, leaving behind a deeply uncomfortable legacy. Number 13. The Sacred Family of Burma. While you can manipulate a single person, controlling an entire bloodline is another story, and that's exactly what nature did with the Sacred Family of Burma. The lineage began in 1826, when explorer John Crawford met Shwe Maong, a young boy gifted to the king of Ava for his unusual condition, hypertrichosis, which caused his body to grow thick hair from head to toe. Shwe Maong became the royal jester and was later rewarded with a wife. Their children continued the strange legacy. His daughter Mafoon and grandson Mong Foset were also covered in hair, as was Mong's daughter, Mahmay. The condition passed through generations, turning the family into living legends. After the Burmese palace was destroyed in 1885, an Italian officer brought them to Europe, where they were showcased as the Sacred Hairy Family of Burma. Barnum even displayed them in America, claiming they brought good fortune. Then, suddenly, the trail went cold. Their family vanished from history, leaving only legend behind. Number 12. Commodore Nut. In 1862, P.T. Barnum, while minding his own business, found George Washington Morrison Nut touring tiny English towns as a sideshow dwarf. Appalled by how poorly he was being treated, Barnum claimed he paid the boy's parents $30,000 for a multi-year contract, with the promise of education included. George became known as Commodore Nut and quickly rose to fame. But backstage, he had beef. His main rival was General Tom Thumb, another dwarf in Barnum's lineup. The tension between them grew intense when both fell for fellow performer Lavinia Warren. In fact, things even turned physical. When Lavinia picked thumb, Nut took it personally and swore off romance for years. Though the heartbreak cut deep, he kept performing. Nut became known for his quick wit, polished manners, and solid stage presence. Unlike most in the circus scene, he wasn't forgotten. His rivalry and unfiltered attitude left a mark that went far beyond just his height. He was more than an act. He was unforgettable and unbelievable. Number 11. The Grand Buffalo Hunt. Barnum had a knack for turning free events into money-making chaos. In June 1843, he bought 15 weak young bison calves for $700, determined to turn a profit. Figuring most New Yorkers knew nothing about the actual West, he repackaged the docile calves as wild buffalo for an upcoming rodeo. On August 31, 1843, he staged his Grand Buffalo Hunt in Hoboken, New Jersey, but not before securing stakes in both the ferry companies and the food stands. Entry was free, but everything else wasn't. Over 24,000 people took Barnum's ferries, some clinging to rails, with fights and near drownings along the way. When the show started, the terrified calves were forced into a chaotic stampede that smashed through fences. One man died after falling from a tree. Others were nearly trampled. And yet, most people were thrilled. It was dramatic, messy, and didn't cost a dime. Barnum walked away with $3,500, the 1840s version of an $88,000 hustle. Number 10. The Alligator Girl. Esther Parnell was born with ichthyosis, a condition that hardened and cracked her skin until it looked like fish scales. Crowds called her the Alligator Girl, and promoters leaned into it, but Esther refused pity. She stepped on stage beside her brother Bill, who shared her condition, performing as the Alligator Twins under Joe Hilton's banner. People stared, and she made sure they paid for it. In 1947, she married a musician, had her first child, and kept touring on her own terms. She raised 7 children, appeared in small horror films, and performed until 1982. Esther didn't hide behind makeup or excuses. She turned her freakish difference into a fantastic livelihood. When people whispered, she worked harder. When they gawked, she smiled right back. She died in 2003, remembered not as a sideshow act, but as a mother who built a full life from what others called deformity. She wasn't just strong, she was unapologetically herself. Number 9. Hottentot Venus. Sarah Bartman was born into the Khoikhoi tribe in South Africa during the 18th century. Her life was shattered at 16 when European-led soldiers attacked during her betrothal ceremony, killing her family and leaving her widowed. Taken to Cape Town, she became a servant before being shipped to England 5 years later. There, her body became a spectacle. With exaggerated features, especially her hips, she was gawked at for 4 years. Later taken to France, she was renamed Hottentot Venus and displayed nearly naked, wearing only a loincloth. She died at 26. But even in death, the exploitation continued. French scientists cut out her brain and genitals and kept them on display for over a century, not removed until 1974. After years of activism, Nelson Mandela helped bring her remains home to South Africa in 2002. Her story wasn't just a tragedy. It exposed the brutal intersection of racism, pseudoscience, and the so-called curiosity of Western entertainment. Back in the days, humans were quite crazy. Number 8. Emma Leech. Long before Barnum's fame, Emma Leech stood at the beginning of American exhibition history. 22 inches tall, she became the first documented human curiosity displayed in the United States, sometime in mid-17th century Boston. Her portrait appeared beside politicians in Ames's almanac, yet she was the only one given an article. The writer described her body in unsettling detail before admitting he couldn't confirm it. because Emma had refused an examination. That refusal said everything. She couldn't stop people from writing about her, but she could stop them from owning her body. In a time when consent didn't exist for women like her, that quiet no was defiance. The world remembered her measurements, not her mind, yet buried in that crude article is the first act of bodily resistance in sideshow history. Emma Leech didn't chase fame or attention, she simply drew a line and kept her dignity on the only terms she had. Number 7. The Pig-Faced Lady. This wasn't just a rumor. For years, she was a bizarre obsession. The myth took hold in the 17th century, but exploded during the winter of 1814 to 1815. Rumors swirled across London about a noble family's daughter who supposedly had the face of a pig. Newspapers ran with it, claiming eyewitness accounts. As the story grew, circuses jumped in, each claiming to showcase their own pig-faced woman. But it was all fake. None of them existed. The worst of these scams appeared in the 1850s when one traveling fair took things to an extreme. Their so-called pig-faced lady was actually a bear, shaved, drunk, and forced into a woman's dress. People bought tickets, thinking they were seeing some rare human-animal hybrid. Instead, it was pure cruelty, disguised as curiosity. No one knows who started the original story, but it spread like wildfire and lingered for decades, a twisted example of how far sideshows would go to cash in on myth. Number 6. Isaac W. Sprague. Isaac W. Sprague grew up like any other child until he hit 12. That's when he started losing weight uncontrollably, no matter how much he ate. His body just kept shrinking. As an adult, he could barely hold a job and eventually joined a traveling circus. Not long after, he was picked up by P.T. Barnum and performed under the name The Human Skeleton. When Barnum's museum caught fire, Sprague narrowly escaped with his life. He later married and had 3 sons, but constant money issues led him back into the circus. A gambling habit only made things worse. He carried a flask of milk around his neck, sipping it constantly just to stay conscious. By the time he died in 1887, he was 5 feet and 6 inches and weighed just over 40 pounds. He donated his body to science, hoping to find answers. Isaac never fully understood what had happened to him, and neither did anyone else. All right, guys, now, let's move to number 5. Kitty Smith. Well, this is just heartbreaking. Kitty Smith's story began with violence. At 9 years old, her father held her arms against a hot stove until they burned beyond saving. Surgeons amputated them, and she spent her childhood in a home for orphans. She later told people it was an accident, maybe out of protection or denial, but the court records were clear. He walked free. Kitty refused to fade into pity. She learned to write, paint, and sew using her feet. At 18, she wrote her story, printed it herself, and sold copies door to door for 25 cents. She made over $35,000, a fortune for a young disabled woman in that era. Eventually, she joined a sideshow, not for fame, but for independence. People stared at her feet while she built a life with them. Kitty Smith didn't beg for kindness. She demanded respect through work, self-reliance, and quiet endurance. She wasn't a freaky act. She was proof that survival can be art. Number 4. Lilipuchia. Now this is just insane. Coney Island's Dreamland Park once featured a fully functioning town built for little people and run by them. Called Lilipuchia, it housed over 300 performers, all living in a scaled-down replica of a European village. Everything was miniaturized. Homes, streets, shops, parks, even the post office. Lilipuchia wasn't just a backdrop. It had its own mayor, police force, and currency. Tourists wandered through the small streets, watched the residents live, and took in performances put on daily. The village drew massive crowds, especially when the park brought in a full-sized person to walk through, just to highlight the contrast. Though it was marketed as whimsical, Lilipuchia was also deeply rooted in the freak show tradition. The residents weren't just performers, they were part of an ongoing fascination with bodies that didn't fit the norm. Still, many of them found real community and worked there. For better or worse, Lilipuchia became one of Coney Island's most famous and freaky oddities. Number 3. The French Giant. Jean Behin was impossible to miss. He was born in Belgium in 1805, and his size alone drew attention. Some said 7 feet, others claimed 8. But what stood out more was his confidence. He sang, acted, and joked his way through European theaters before signing with Barnum, who saw pure profit in his presence. Jean wasn't just tall, he was outspoken. He clashed with Colonel Goshen, another giant performer, and their feud spilled into the papers. Barnum turned it into a spectacle, advertising a staged rematch that packed tents across America. Off-stage, Behin's life was messy. Public arguments, a troubled marriage, constant rumors. Yet his personality was magnetic. He filled every room he entered, not just with height, but with defiance. Jean died in Brooklyn in 1873, leaving behind little but tall tales and a few fading photos. He wasn't a myth or a freak. He was a man who refused to shrink for anyone. Number 2. Violeta. Violeta was born with tetra amelia syndrome, a rare condition that left her without arms or legs. Despite that, she was surprisingly agile and independent. She could brush her own hair, sew fabric, and even thread a needle with no help. Her other senses were said to be more sensitive than most, and she didn't suffer from any other major issues. On stage, she performed under the name the beautiful armless and legless Venus. Doctors were fascinated by her body and often described her torso as flawless. At the end of her show, a nurse would carry her through the crowd, letting the audience come up and touch her if they wished. But not everyone respected boundaries. Some men, and occasionally women, tried to kiss her. When that happened, Violeta didn't hesitate. She jabbed them in the chin with her shoulder, hard enough to make some cry. Her condition didn't define her. She set her own rules. Now let's end this with Number 1. The octoman. Rudy was born carrying another life within him. A parasitic twin had fused to his body, leaving him with extra limbs, a partial head, and an unused leg. He learned to move with crutches, working under the sideshow name, the octoman. Posters made him sound like a comic book creature, but Rudy's life was far from fantasy. Through the 1970s and 80s, he performed quietly, earning enough to get by while living with constant pain. When doctors offered to remove the twin in 2008, he declined, not because he wanted to keep it, but because it had always been part of him. Money was a reason, too. He stopped touring in his later years and lived privately until his death from a stroke in 2023. The headlines were small, just like his fame, but his story lingered among performers who remembered him not as the octoman, but as Rudy, a man who lived exactly as he was. If you've enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you very soon.